Hello, everybody. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome. My name is Robin Dunbar. I'm the Associate Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education and the Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning. And it is indeed a pleasure to have you here today on a slightly, by California standards, rainy day. I'm from Texas. This is not yet a rainy day, but we're thrilled to see you. And in just a moment or two, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Professor Hester Gelber. But before I do, let me put a couple of things on your radar for next steps in our series. You have a flyer in front of you, and unfortunately, the first next step is that we've had to cancel our April presentation. So please, as you're looking at your own calendars, mark the May presentation by Professor Jim Campbell. We're really looking forward to that. We'll have a good bit more detail for you, and we'll get the word out to the community about the title and topic as we have that. But for now, please put that May date on your calendars, and we look forward to seeing you here in this room again. So as I said, we're very privileged today to have Professor Hester Gelber with us. She's a professor in the Department of Religious Studies and recently the department chair. Until recently, I should say, the department chair. That's probably a yay. Yes. And she's speaking to us on the topic of getting creative, which is something I think of personal relevance to all of us, whether it's through our teaching, our creative work, and our research, or just our daily lives. Hester did her undergraduate work at Cornell and then went on to do master's and PhD work in medieval history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Came to Stanford in 1978 as a lecturer first in the Department of Philosophy, but by 1982 had moved into what's become her permanent academic home in the Department of Religious Studies. Many of you, I think, are well familiar with her work, but for those of you who are not, Professor Gelber's efforts focus on late medieval religious thought, and she teaches courses on the philosophy of religion and medieval Christianity. She's written extensively. She's received numerous awards and fellowships for this work, and the current book project is a study of the development of medieval religious cosmos as a mythologized system of retributive justice. So,
I'm not going to talk about that.
And what I like is we can go from language like that to what you may find interesting, and I certainly did, which is the language that Professor Gelber uses to convey this work and this passion to the students in her classes. And here's how you might, if you're a student, intersect this award-winning professor. You might take a course called Murder in the Cathedral. Perhaps you were in the Crusades, which is a course that she co-developed with Professors Jennifer Summit and Philippe Buch, and which was funded by a Hoagland Award for Innovations in Undergraduate Teaching. You may find yourself in Finding Voices, Forging Selves, or Self-Reflections, The Examined Life. Switching gears a little bit, Religion in Science Fiction and Fantasy, or Just Who Are We? Science Fiction and the Futuristic Self. You may find yourself on a journey with Professor Gelber called Mystical Journeys Beyond Knowing and Reason. So a completely different way to engage the world of this professor. And whether you enter her world through her research or her teaching, I think you will greatly appreciate that she's here today to speak because of this ability to take the highest level of academic inquiry and bring it into the lives and the motivations of learners. She's been deeply involved with undergraduate education throughout her time at Stanford. I mentioned the Hoagland Award for Innovations in Undergraduate Teaching. She's also the John and Lydia Pierce Mitchell University Fellow in Undergraduate Education. And just as her academic works often invoke or take us into a world beyond, she speaks from the point of view of students and their world beyond the classroom, having been a resident fellow at both Twain and Castagno. So that's a different kind of world beyond. And for those of us, and I share this with you, who've had the privilege of living with undergraduates, who've had the experience of, at the end of a day of teaching, going home and having our home in the same place as their home, it is in fact a privilege to get to know them in this way. And it is a tremendous motivator for getting creative, which is the overarching theme today. And as I welcome Professor Gelber to the podium, ways that you infuse creativity in your teaching and wherever you decide to take us.
I'm just going to really basically talk about this course that I'm doing. So I'm going to say a few words about the genesis of this course, what set me going. I began first thinking about this course and teaching it in the 90s. And I taught it a couple of times back then, and this is a course, and part of what got me going and thinking about this, this project was I didn't think students were reading, and I didn't think that they were doing creative work, except when they might take a drawing class, or if they were in engineering and were making little cars that would run around in the quad. For the most part, our students, while they were getting a lot of excellent education in in learning about various spheres of knowledge, and in being able, since the early 90s, to engage in a lot of research projects, the opportunities to just expand the imagination were lacking, and I really felt that that was a gap in what we offered them. So I wanted to find a way to do that. And I'd also gotten interested in science fiction myself as an adult, oddly enough, because usually people sort of approach this when they're kids, and I didn't. We had an awful fire in our house in 1976, and I spent half of my time finding every escapist bit of literature I could find, and science fiction was was about as escapist as you get. But I got very, very interested in what was going on in those novels, and the ways in which those novels create alternative worlds, often with a very thick attention to anthropology, because in order to create these worlds, you really have to do that. And so the confluence of things, it occurred to me in the 90s that I could try this, teaching a course, introducing students to religious studies topics through science fiction literature, and asking them to create a short story. I only taught it a couple of times then, and then I went to a course that I started teaching just as a sophomore seminar that didn't have the creative writing piece of it, where I just taught the novels. And then I resurrected it as the full quarter piece a couple of years ago, and I've been teaching it since and intend to teach it for the next few years, where I brought back that piece of creative writing. And I think that this is something that is very valuable. So this is the course, Religion and Science Fiction and Fantasy, Ways of Thinking. It meets various ways of thinking, ways of doing, categories. It captures 2 of those. And just to go over the aims of the course more specifically, I want to introduce students to a variety of ways of thinking about religion, particularly in the contemporary imagination. So these novels are a way of digging into what people out there just in the regular world, how they're thinking about religion at the moment, when they're not consciously thinking, I want to think about religion, but are incorporating religion into a larger novel project. And so there's a kind of unself-conscious way in which they're streaming the contemporary culture into the books. Not that they're not thinking, but I don't think they're thinking about religion in these books in the way that we would. I want to encourage an intensive reading experience that reacquaints students with reading for pleasure as well as for profit. I know that at least some of you in the room with gray hair and are probably grew up in a context where TV was not readily available, and where the great joys of reading were the way to escape from family obligations and into other worlds. And that whole experience of reading voraciously and just having your mind completely taken over for 2 days by a book is something that I don't think a lot of our students give themselves time to do now. They may have had a Harry Potter experience growing up, or they may have had some of that where, Lord of the Rings or something, but they're not, when they escape, when they let go of their overly scheduled lives now, they may watch a movie or go on the computer and connect with their friends. But that experience of just dedicating a couple of days, a weekend where you're curled up with a book and your mother doesn't really say anything to you to come to help with the dishes or anything for a while because you're reading and that's a value, that kind of thing. I just wanted to get them back into that experience, in part because I think reading enhances the imaginative capacity. I think that space in which you let a book just take over your mind completely, there isn't anything really quite like it. Even an intensely engaging movie isn't quite the same thing. And I think that the depth of knowledge you gain from seeing the intricacies of character development, seeing the ways in which people interact, developing vocabulary, expanding your horizons, all of that takes place in novels in a way that doesn't really take place almost anywhere else. So I wanted to use them in what I'm doing. And then I wanted, as I said, to incorporate a serious creative project into the learning experience. I wanted them then to apply what they were thinking about in the writing of their own short story. Now, I have a confession to make. I've never done this myself, so I'm asking them to do things that I have not done myself. But that doesn't mean that I don't think it's good. So, the course description. So, as I mentioned, science fiction and fantasy writers often create new alternative worlds, and in the process, they transform older religious traditions and invent new ones. The text in the course, so in choosing the text, my criteria for choosing the text, they had to be well written. They had to be well-developed alternative worlds, and they had to incorporate various things from the religious context into the making of the novel. So the novels, and spread out over a wide variety of traditions. So in the novels, the diverse religious traditions they address: Islam, Buddhism, Catholic, Protestant, and Mormon forms of Christianity, Mayan religion, and voodoo. We could do more, but that's probably as much as we can handle. And then a number of traditional religious themes appear. So free will and determinism, immortality, apocalypse and redemption, elements of religious institutions and practice, and also things like myth, ritual, prophecy, the messianic hero, monasticism, mysticism. So these novels really provide a very thick way to get students engaged with the vocabulary and the lens that we use when we are thinking from a religious studies perspective and standpoint. We can just really get them to dig in. What is a ritual? How does myth operate in Dune? What is prophecy here? What are we thinking about? It really does have a very expansive capacity for engaging them. So these are the texts that I've been using. Frank Herbert's Dune, Orson Scott Card's two of his novels, Seventh Son and Red Prophet, Neil Gaiman's Sandman, which is a graphic novel, William Gibson's Count Zero, Pat Murphy's Falling Woman, and Sherry Tepper's Grass. So the creative writing piece is a little different than what you would do in a normal written assignment. The main assignment is the short story. There are a number of other things, reflection papers, short papers in preparation for that, but this is a longer paper than they normally write. It needs to be at least 20 to 30 pages in length in order to give them the scope and the expansion to do what they need to do. A lot of it might be dialogue or description or other kinds of things that will write themselves a bit more readily than if they were doing a research project. So I find that they can do this. But it is a longer, you have to be able to give them the space to do a longer piece. To make the assignments easier, I have two preliminary assignments. There's a 3-page paper detailing the religious themes and traditions they plan to exploit, along with a bibliography of sources for the background information. And I've played around with having this paper go first or second. And I find I need to do it first because I want them to foreground the thinking about religion. And if I have it go later, the project becomes a science fiction story and the religion piece gets buried a bit. And the second is a 3 to 5 page paper describing the world in which you plan to set your story. So it's really important and powerful that they set up a backstory. Now we know for novelists they will often spend a lot of time creating backstories for their characters and doing that kind of thing. For short stories, we often don't think of them as needing that kind of detail or requiring that kind of thing, but if I didn't ask them to set up this world, we would get short stories that were really just classic short stories with a twist, something with a little twist, be a science fiction thing. It wouldn't have the thickness. Many of the stories the students write could be chapters of novels, and they work fine that way because of the backstory, the world, and in creating a world, a thick world, that really gets them going and thinking about how religion fits in. So getting them comfortable, this is a major piece. The students are often really shy about this project. They want to do it. They're very anxious. They really, are eager to do it, but they can be nervous about it. So in setting it up, I only usually don't have more than a couple of students who have taken creative writing courses or who have been writing short stories or novels themselves growing up. We get a few of those. But most of the students are writing a short story for the first time. So it makes them quite nervous. And what I find is that it's really important to provide them with at least one one-on-one session, often more. So I make myself available to them, a lot of discussion with them. They get stuck, they get, I'm blocked, I don't know what to do, I've got this scenario, but I don't know where it goes. But having them talk it through with me, my sort of giving them suggestions of ways that they can take it, then unlocks that and gets them going. So some hand-holding, being aware of the students who are particularly nervous, giving them a chance to come in and get comfortable. This is a very important thing to do with them with this class. They don't know how to do this, unlike a lot of the other classes that they take where they really pretty much do know what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing. So the discussions in the classroom are very lively. They're very important in discussing the novels, getting them engaged and doing it. So they write these one-page reflection pages that they share, and they share through a Google Doc. Now, I set this up to show you this class meets two of the new ways of thinking, ways of doing categories, the aesthetic and interpretive inquiry mode or way, and these are some of the objectives that in getting it accepted I outlined for what we do. So they can appreciate the nature of human responses to meaningful cultural objects. We're reading novels, they're cultural objects, and distinguish among the different methods to interpret those responses. Acquire and assess techniques of interpretation, they have to do that, include close reading techniques, criticism, analysis of cultural texts. Recognize the frameworks for thought and action implicit in human practices, analyze the different assumptions underpinning those frameworks. That goes again without saying. Understand how expressive works, and this I think is particularly kind of interesting given the confluence of things in this class, how expressive works articulate responses to fundamental human problems and convey important values. They don't normally think about novels in quite this way, but thinking about them through a religious studies lens sets up this problematic quite clearly. And then the creative expressions, it's even more of a slam dunk, I think, should be able to explore their own potential to produce original creative projects, engage in artistic collaboration and the creative reinterpretation of art made by others. That happens both in the discussion of the novels and also in our workshopping. The last couple of weeks of class are set up to workshop their stories. So they share them with others, we work on them, they meet again with me, we're talking about what to do, and they end up then handing in their final product during finals week as a finished, revised project. So they have a chance to really work on it. Take creative risks beyond their comfort zone, they're definitely doing that. Experience what it is to make the unimagined possible and real. Well, this, again, if you write a science fiction story or a fantasy story, you're making the unimagined possible and real. Appreciate how experimentation, failure, and revision can play a valuable role in the creation of successful and innovative works. They have opportunities to do that. And explore the role of artistic expression in addressing issues that face society. So I just think a course like this, I could see adapting a course like this to a number of different venues. I could think about doing this in a philosophy class where you wanted the students to be exploring. I mean, I've sort of done that myself with the classes on identity that Robin mentioned, where you could set up novels to do this. You could do it in a kind of historical thing where you plunge them down into an historical period or moment through fiction, and to see what people have been doing with it is a way of thinking about how historians and people in the cultural arena extrapolate from what they know. So I'm going to now sort of run through the weeks quickly. The introductions going around, everybody does this, always go around the room, say who you are and all the rest of it. But the interesting thing about this particular kind of class is that the students come from such a diverse variety of backgrounds, religious traditions, commitments, forms of curiosity, from the sciences, from a variety of contexts. So getting them to come together and talk a little bit about themselves and why they're interested in this particular class begins already to create that sense that we're in a very wide, broad context for thinking about religion and the world. That everything can kind of begin to cook. So the content for the week includes a discussion about how narratives and the conception of worlds are integral to religious thinking in preparation for the courses that unfolds. So religions are carried on and transmitted through narratives, through mythologies, and through various kinds of instruction. And one of the ways that people sometimes think about religion is to think about religions as forms of world construction. That we form these cosmologies, these worlds, these expectations, these assumptions about the way things work, and then we step into those worlds and we inhabit them. And that religions often function that way. So in thinking about the fictional project and the real world project, the two things will map on each other nicely. So the first week we read Dune. I assume that many of you have probably read Dune. Dune is one of those great classics, of course, and Dune pulls in all kinds of interesting things. Genetic determinism, is there free will? The monasticism, corrupted monasticism, tradition. How does tradition play in both esoteric and exoteric forms? The idea of ritual practice, a ritual that involves the spice, a mind-altering experience that people have. So it connects up with ideas about mysticism. The people of Arrakis, who are basically sort of a kind of Berber Islamic form of society. And then we have the Bene Gesserit, who are a kind of quasi-Christian monastic group, and then we have the Buddhism mirrored in some of the soldiers that are created as kind of half-robot soldiers in this context. So there are a number of things that you can begin to pull in and to make them think about here. And one of the interesting pieces is that it begins to have some of the themes that will go through the course and through the quarter that I think capture some of the things that are percolating out there in the culture, in people's minds as they think about religion. One is a kind of odd, whose reasons, whose causes I actually don't fully understand. There seems to be a deep desire for people to share the contents of their minds with others. To be able to read other people's minds and have them read yours, to mind meld, to have one over mind, to have some kind of whether you put it into a computer or you just can do this, or you drink the spice and then suddenly you know everything, that this kind of desire for an omniscient connection with everyone and others is out there, and it plays through this literature in a sort of really interesting way. I don't know what to make of that. It's a desire that strikes me as both odd and interesting, and it's also impossible, but maybe not. Who knows? One of the other themes that also runs through all of this is the idea of prophecy. So for those of you who are knowledgeable about the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, prophets and the kind of what gets called a Jeremiad, the voices that say, if you don't repent, if you don't mend your ways, the world will come to an end, God will destroy you, terrible things will happen. Well, what I think of as a prophetic voice actually has been appropriated by many of these writers. These writers pick up the prophetic voice and they say, if you don't mend your ways, look what's going to happen. There's going to be this dystopic horror that will result. The world will end. You didn't take care of it. You destroyed it with atomic weapons. You destroyed it with environmental depredation. You destroyed the world. You have to mend your ways. So there's a kind of prophetic voice that plays out various kinds of consequences in this, and again, that hooks back in interesting ways to religious tradition. One of the other things about this Dune, the Dune series, I don't know if those of you who read the first one went on and tried to read all the books in the series. It's not a reading adventure that I would recommend. The first couple of books after Dune are readable and kind of interesting, and then it really falls apart. And part of the reason I think it falls apart interestingly, again, comes back to a religious theme. If you take death out of the equation, if immortality becomes a reality, narrative falls apart. Narrative seems to require death. And if you don't have death in there, it gets really boring. It goes on and on and on and on and on into nothing. So, and there are a number of these authors who try that experiment and don't succeed. I don't use some of the more interesting ones. Greg Bear does this and tries to all kinds of experiments with every conceivable kind of immortality you can imagine. And it just really doesn't work as a novel. You have no ending that is a satisfying ending. You have no place to land in the thing. It just ends up diffusing off into all kinds of spaces. So it's interesting to think about our human condition as deeply tied to an ending. Books versus films. We do look at some visual media. I really don't. It's a little bit of bait and switch here. I do talk about doing movies in this, but I don't do very many because I really do want them to be focusing primarily on reading. But we do Blade Runner and set that up with Neil Gaiman's graphic novel. One of my hopes, as I said, would be to have a student who actually would have dared to try and do one of these as a graphic novel, but it might take just too much time to do. You couldn't quite, unless you stick figures everywhere, but I would love to see somebody try that. Okay, so the weeks 3 and 4 are dedicated to Orson Scott Card, who is a very prolific Mormon writer. I do run into a little bit of difficulty. His politics, particularly around gay and lesbian issues, are problematic. The students they can make some students a little bit uneasy. None of that is in the novels. And the novels, at least not the ones we're reading, and the novels themselves take up a number of very, very interesting issues. And so I want them to read these anyway. Card, the two I assign are not, most people who know Card know him from Ender's Game and Xenocide and The Speaker for the Dead, which are quite interesting books. And then there was a recent movie, Ender's Game. But I'm doing the Alvin Maker series, which is a series, a quite lengthy series. We do the first 2. The first 3 books are really interesting, but we only have time for 2, where the American history has changed into an alternate history. And instead of all of the things that you would sort of think of as our world, the people of our historical world are plunked down in a different context. So the Iroquois have an industrial nation in the north. The South is a kingdom. George Washington has gotten murdered and killed. There's all of these different things that are going on that are quite distinctive. And also about this world, one of the things that's different about this world is that all of the sort of everyday, ordinary magic beliefs work. So dowsing and the kinds of superstitions and hexes and the things that one would think about are all really work in this world. So the 7th son of the 7th son is the hero, the sort of slightly messianic hero who comes in. But unlike Dune, the setup of these novels is very much a matter of is not determined in this way. So free will is an important aspect of these novels. And the choices and decisions one makes have real consequences that the characters have to learn from. And one of the other things, it's another theme that runs through a number of these novels that I think is really interesting to play with, is that I think the science fiction in particular, but fantasy to a lesser extent, but science fiction genre is a genre that enables us to confront the idea of the other. So if you think of the movie Alien, which is probably the most sort of extreme kind of thing, you know, and in movies often the other is an attacking, horrifying presence that is just a challenge. In novels, the other is a very interesting opportunity to learn how to increase one's empathy, understanding, stretch one's imagination, move out, make mistakes that then have consequences. So in Orson Scott Card's pieces, there's a Native American, Native Americans figure prominently, as one might imagine from his Mormon roots, but that there's a genocide, which is a real historical genocide that happens with Lolowasiki, who's Tecumseh's brother, and there's the Tippecanoe and Taylor too, kind of the massacre that takes place. And they have to deal with this genocidal reality and what, the horror of that and what that means. And then Alvin, the main character, spends a lot of time with the Native American communities, traveling with them and incorporating their perspective into his own and thinking about things. So there's the ways of thinking about alterity, about otherness, and how to expand one's imagination to increase acceptance is an important subtext of this. or not even subtext, a text. Okay, so Sandman and Blade Runner, we changed gears here with this one. The Sandman series is Neil Gaiman is one of the most well-received graphic novelists, but he also has a number of other fantasy novels. He has one, American Gods, that I've thought about using and I've had other people use, but there are all kinds of very interesting gods who are present in the book, but it's not so much about religion. So I haven't used that particular text. But in his Sandman series, we take up the question of dreams and dreaming and what role do dreams play in our imaginations and in our imaginative lives? How important are they? What do they give us? And he uses a number of symbols from traditional European religions, so there are angels and demons and things like that in his context that we can play with. But the idea of dreaming, and then the question of what's real and what isn't real. So the skeptical piece that comes up also in Blade Runner, and then The Matrix, which is kind of an offshoot too of these things, and the Blade Runner, which is very loosely based on Philip K. Dick's novella, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Then we move to Count Zero and William Gibson. And William Gibson is one of my favorites. I love William Gibson. He's one of the most existential of the writers, and also one of the most difficult, and I just keep him in there even though the students kind of have trouble with him, because I just really love William Gibson, so I'm sorry. They have to read it. It's the second of his novels. Neuromancer is the first, and Count Zero is the second, and he just plunges you down into his world, and he takes up a number of issues, kind of creating a mythology of the quantum mechanics and quantum physics. So the main outlines of this particular, the villain, the brain in the vat, the villain who is a major corporate guy who is being kept alive as the brain in the vat by his minions, and who has the hubristic desire to know everything. He wants to know everything. And so as the novel plays out, which the students don't see, they have to be drawn into it, is that Gibson is doing a riff on the story of the fall. That if you eat of the tree of knowledge, if you try to have the hubristic desire to know what God knows, you will fall. And this guy is doing it in the quantum mechanical world. What becomes clear is that this aim is impossible. It's not a possibility. He is trying to figure out what is happening with these little boxes that are floating around, these little artistic boxes that are like Cornell boxes, where they have random sort of things poked around in them, and I have the students look at real Cornell boxes and travel down that road, and you can take a look at those things. But what the main character discovers is that another corporate family, the Tessier Ashpoles, have been living in a big sort of space station, which then they have abandoned as their corporate conglomerate falls apart. And up there in the space station, where nobody lives except one mad guy who's been bringing the Cornell boxes down, all of the detritus of the family's life is now floating around in a very large gravity-free space, with a kind of machine at the top with arms that periodically and randomly pokes down, grabs something, snips it, puts it in a box, and there it is, and there's the Cornell box. So this is not a product of reason. It's not a product of, it is in one sense the purest of art. It's quite lovely, and the randomness of this, and the truth that it's not about knowing everything. That it doesn't get you anywhere. You can't know everything here. The randomness that lies behind this is not explicable. There's not a rationale behind it. So and then at the end, the brain in the vat guy, his destruction occurs when he is discovered in his virtual reality. He's hanging out in the square in front of the Familia Sagrada, Gaudi's church in Spain, and he's hanging out there, and in the garden in the front of that, there's a mosaic that has a lizard in mosaic things, a kind of lizard-like, serpent-like creature, which is the broken the broken serpent of Eden. This is his cracked Eden, his virtual Eden that he's hanging out in, and then he is killed off in this context. He doesn't succeed. So the themes here are sort of obvious, and I hope you can see why I love it. Gibson. Falling Woman, the students last time, I never know which book they're going to really fall in love with. It always seems to be a different one. Last time it was Falling Woman. Pat Murphy, I think this is her best book. Falling Woman is a book in which there's the main character is an archaeologist who has the capacity to go around the world seeing dead people at work. This, of course, as one would imagine, is an extremely valuable skill to have if you're an archaeologist. And she works on Mayan communities down in Mexico. And she goes around and she can see them going about their daily lives, grinding corn and doing what they do. And she's had a difficult time. Before she kind of found her calling in this regard, because when she first started doing this, people thought she was insane, and her husband put her away for a while, and she lost contact with her daughter, and there's backstory here with her family stuff. But we see her doing is going on this dig, and just as happened last year, the Mayan calendar was coming around, and the dead who had never been able to see her before began to be able to see her, and she gets entwined with a sequence of things. There's a priestess at the center of it who had sacrificed her own daughter to save her own community, and it didn't work. And so now the archaeologist whose daughter has come down to join her is getting brought into a context where the priestess of several thousand years ago wants her to sacrifice her daughter now to bring about the change of the. So it gets quite entangled and dramatic, but issues of ritual and sacrifice, of family, of transmission, of the ways in which the personal and the grand design come into conflict are important in this book. And the final book that we read is Sherry Tepper's Grass, a very mind-bending book. Sherry Tepper's great. I don't know, she's an author that many of you probably don't know. She's been a very prolific author. She tends to have a kind of Gaia perspective, so she creates these worlds, and each one is a different world. She will create a world that has its own ecology, and the ecologies can be very distinctive, just quite wild. And if you live in this world, if you inhabit this world, you have to live within the grain of that world in order to actually succeed and be okay. And people come to these worlds, and the worlds get disrupted, and various things happen. There's an ecology on this world that makes, well, it's too complicated even to summarize. It's just very, very complicated. But what happens is an ambassadorial trip to this world because nobody on this world is falling sick with a terrible plague which is devastating all the other known worlds. And so why are these people immune? To try to discover it. And they send this ambassadorial group there, and Marjorie, who's the main character, gets drawn into this, and she's part of a tradition of old Catholicism, which starts off with a lot of views about reproduction and all of that in her home planet, and she's coming here to this planet and bringing these views, and she's got to sort of figure out what's going on in this planet, and it has these monstrous quasi-horses called hippie, which are like dinosaurs that get ridden, and it's really a trip. And a group of mind-melding aliens who inhabit the forest and that she eventually connects up with. So self and other, tolerance, intolerance, mind control and freedom, ritual, question of evil, question of personal responsibility. Personal responsibility is very important and prominent in this particular one. So just to kind of wind up here, give you a sense of, I don't know if you can read these, just grabbed a handful of the titles and topics of student stories. So Lapse, about the consciousness of a pickleweed, I loved that one. Interfinity as a place to escape from responsibility. Sexto Sol, a reworking of Aztec myths. Filterless, which took up science and religion. Temper, festivals and other beings. La Niña de la Noche, ghosts and afterlife. Mother's Truth, about a mother's world. Incarnation, a futuristic Hindu example. Rocco, ecology and religion as a survival mechanism. Glitch, Robots and Personhood, The Snake Bites Its Tail, which took up quantum realities, ripped from the headlines, The Old Gods Are Real, In Search of the True Path, a Buddhist fantasy, Lack, Shadows and Spirits, Mending, a Calvinist alternative, The Order of the Omega, Myth and Story, and a new utopia about robot religion. So these just the kinds of things that the students are doing and taking off with here. And what I've been able to do in past years with this is set aside a little bit of money to make copies of all of these stories and give them to the students so that they have a collection. So we make a book and we give it to them, which makes a very nice enhancement and record. And so just to review some of the main themes: mind meld and mystical experience as a utopian desire, individual spirituality versus religious institutions, the prophetic voice warning of future disaster, and dealing with the other in extreme cases. So open it up to you for questions about what I do with this course and why it's fun and why they get going and so on.
We have time for questions, so please.
Thank you. As I was listening to you, I was wishing I was a student again so I could take your course. And, but I remembered a video I saw recently of Leonard Bernstein talking about teaching and learning. And he was talking about the origins of the word learning, which I can't remember the details of, but he was saying that it originally really meant a reciprocal process of teaching and learning rather than a one-way process. And so I remember at the beginning you said something about you were asking the students to do something that you don't do yourself.
I know.
And so I thought that's one of the issues that I deal with myself in teaching, and I'm part of a group piloting a project called LifeWorks through the VPUE, in which we're trying to offer and design courses that address the needs of the whole student and integrate different things in their lives. But also, the issue that comes up is often for teachers, I think, about how can you ask students to do something that maybe you yourself haven't done, and so that whole sense of bringing the self into the teaching process, and then of course the exhilarating process of doing something with students in which you feel you're learning as well. And so I just wondered if you could comment on that a little bit.
Well, I hadn't set out to spend a life writing stories or novels, although there was a period back in the 70s when I'd gotten my degree and I didn't have a job, and there were no jobs around, and it was not at all clear that I was going to be able to have a career doing this. And so I set out, decided, well, after some depression and some counseling, and what the heck are you going to do with your life? I set out to write a novel. And I had it framed, and I knew what I was going to do, and then I got a job here, and I didn't go and write the novel. So it's about lives diverging and doing these various things. But it was very interesting when I was thinking about doing that, how my imagination shifted. I began thinking about things, imagining things, just differently than I normally did. It really put me into a different space. And so I do appreciate some of this. I don't think I have time. Maybe after retirement, well, I think I'm going to paint pictures and do that kind of thing instead. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hester. I was wondering a little bit about how you judge student success in the course. Is it mainly by their short story?
Yes.
And,
Well, and participation.
And is that mainly because of the quality of the writing or the quality of the world they're imagining in the story? I just want
I don't think, I probably shouldn't admit this, but I don't think about this class as a highly judgmental class where you sit down and you go, okay, you tick off these boxes and then that's you've done this. But I look to see how powerfully they've engaged with the project, and I can judge that pretty easily from what they, how they go about it and what they produce. I'm not thinking about this as something that they could send out and get published, although some of them might end up doing something. But I'm thinking about it, again, how well they've developed the religious themes, how well those lenses have been realized in the story, how coherent the story is, how it works as a story, whether the various things that we've been talking about all quarter are clearly helping them and do this project. So while I can make gradations of judgment about the quality of what the students are doing, it really is a fairly individual thing. I mean, I'm not thinking, okay, the life of a pickleweed versus a robotic religion, you know, that there isn't a way to say one is better than the other. It has to do with how the level of engagement that's quite clear, and whether they've really, you know, I can see them growing. There's also a great deal of discussion that goes on, so I have a sense of who they are around the table, a lot of sense of how much they're really getting into it, how much these novels are enlivening their imaginations, how much they're thinking about them. And that too gives me a sense of who's really taking hold of this course. So I'm not going to, you know, and somebody would have to really screw up very badly to do really badly in the course, because this is an experimental class, and I'm not thinking, okay, your grammar is perfect, and we do go through some of that in the, you know, is the tone of this right? Do you have, you know, the dialogue, the dialectical feel of it? You know, we talk about all those kinds of standard literary things that people would talk about. Do you have a consistency? Does the trajectory of the story make sense? Do you have, you know, a compelling motivations in the story? There are lots of things we talk about in this, and they end up doing, I think, often really quite nice work. And no matter what they're doing, they are grabbing hold. So having to write something like this, I'm reasonably certain that this is a course that they will not forget. They might forget other courses, but this is not one they're going to forget. Yeah.
The idea of science fiction is fascinating as a way to come into this. How do you think, like if you went back and did a class on historical novels, what do you think the difference between those two would be?
I think, well, it would depend on what you wanted to do. So I'm quite happy to have them really just enjoy these books. And one of the problems for me as somebody who's trained as an historian, that historical novels are often not that enjoyable, because I'm just thinking, oh, that's wrong, and that's wrong, and that's wrong. And that's, you know, which is not necessarily so great. But I could see how you could definitely do this. So if what you wanted to do was to think about how in the modern imagination, I mean, you see it all the time at PBS, for instance. If you wanted to talk about how in the modern imagination, historical figures are reconfigured and understood, and what kinds of biases does that create in our popular imagination about Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, and there was a recent PBS thing about Anne Boleyn recently. There's lots of things that you could do with that, where you could kind of track through what the ways are that people are thinking about this in a kind of more popular is not quite the right word, but secular setting, or setting, you know, that's out there. And then what is it, and you could have discussions about what does that mean, and where does that get us, and as an historian, how would you do this differently? And you could have really good ones like Umberto Eco, where you say, okay, well, yes, he really got it all, partly because he's using pastiches and just pulling in texts that we know were real from the Middle Ages in his book, but on his books, but and then compare and contrast that, and talk about, you know, and there might be some issues about what one's responsibility is then to the past realities, and how that conflicts with fiction writing, and whether that's important or not. And I mean, so I could think, I mean, not quite sure. I'm not in a history department, so I'm not quite thinking about that. But I think you definitely could use some of this to kind of track interesting things.
Yeah, because I'm drawn to more of the historical
Right.
novel, but I never really thought that you can go into it, but you can. Like you're
Absolutely.
saying. Yeah, you can go back into the past to write about the past, and you could. I mean,
Yeah,
people
you
might
could.
not. Yeah.
And if you wanted to, say you wanted to think about an ethics issue, I mean, those I think lend themselves beautifully to this. If you wanted to, that you could look at the ways in which novels. I mean, I could do that with these novels really quite easily. We do some of that anyway, and you know, I could move it to. And as I say, I did it with one on personal identity, where we had a lot more philosophical texts that we worked with, and then read those against some of the personal identity issues in the science fiction realm. That also stacks up quite nicely. You can do something like that quite easily. Yeah.
Do you have any sense from the students who've gone through the class about what impact having written a short story has on their willingness or lack of fear to take on other creative projects?
I really don't know. It'd be interesting to find out. I think with the new ways of thinking, ways of doing assessments that people are going to be doing, it might be interesting to see down the road what people actually do. They take it because they just want to. You know, that sounds like fun. I want to do that. Or they may have read a fair amount of science fiction and just want to jump in, or they want the opportunity to write such a story. I do know that I think it does have an effect on a certain kind of confidence. Because I think the students who are particularly nervous about the project, when they finished and have succeeded in doing it, I think that there's a real feeling of accomplishment that happens with that. But whether they go on and do anything more, I don't know. I do know that there's at least one student. I don't know whether he's been published, but I know that after he took the course in the 90s, he lives in San Francisco, and I know he's a novelist and writes novels. I don't know whether he's published. I'd have to go back and check. Yeah.
Yeah, going to the students, what are the biggest challenges for them?
I think, well, it varies from student to student, but the confidence issue is a big one. Can I do this thing? And they're diving into deep water, and they just are doing this. And so, getting the world set up and getting them to talk about what they want to do and how they're going to do it. You have to keep returning to that. And then sometimes, although I don't see it in this class, I sometimes see in other classes where students will take on something that's a little too close to their own system of values, and so to write about it can sometimes create a kind of challenge that they didn't think they were quite ready for. But there's enough. This is such a fictional project. They can kind of skirt around that. But you do see them, like in the Calvinist World, Alternative World one. That was a student who was writing very much. He was writing about the early Calvin's Geneva, and somebody who was there and was torn between the religious values and things, and kind of an alternative world like Orson Scott Card, but in Calvin's Geneva. And he was playing around with things that I know were quite significant to him. And sometimes that means that they can't let loose as much as one would like them to, really just get very imaginative. Like the student who did the Sexto Sol one and did the Aztec myths, he stayed pretty close to those myths. He didn't break out enough. So sometimes just getting them to be really creative. And I'm not sure I have an answer for that. I mean, they're doing what they're doing. I'm okay with it. It's like, go be happy, go do what you're doing.
One thing I also want to say is that to read one novel a week would be a lot. How do they do the writing at the same time? And that would be tough.
It's a lot of work. Yeah. The thing the one page reflection papers on the novels and the discussion in class helps and ratchets them forward. I'm quite sure that they don't end up reading all of every novel, that there are some of them during midterms and so on. But I do know that they do take it seriously, and they do get into them, and they really enjoy them. So they want to, even if they get caught up on time a little bit, that they want to come back to them and read them. And I do know, from, as I said, it's sort of interesting, Dune, Grass, Falling Woman, which one is going to be the favorite? I don't know. I used to do Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, which I also love, but it's gotten a little dated. And it's full of such data dumps in the middle of it that it's a little hard for the students to grind through, even though it's a great novel and worth just reading the first chapter. But that's one that was also a favorite in the past.
So I have a question. Mm-hmm. I'll speak so the room can hear as well, but we've heard about story making and story reading, and what we just experienced was storytelling by you that was pretty amazing. Do you think about storytelling in any active way in this or other classes that?
Well, I think storytelling is part of what we do. I don't think about it very consciously, but growing up in the family that I grew up in, storytelling was part of what people did. My parents told us stories they made up. I told the younger kids stories. And storytelling as a way to convey information was something that we just all did, and it works in a class. So if you're doing something that works, you keep doing it. So I think, but I have not given it great thought in that sense. It's just one of those things that does. But narrative, and I do think about narrative. I think about narrative strategies, and because in religious studies, narrative is something that you do have to think about, and in this particular kind of class, it's also something that we're being conscious about in the class.
Other questions? Right at one. Those who know me know I'll wait 10 seconds after saying, are there any questions? All right. Well, thank you very much, Hester. It was wonderful.
Well, you're welcome.
Look forward to more. Thank you all. Enjoy your afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you again in May, if not before.